Hello, you're welcome to the Future of Leadership podcast, where we discuss about issues related to leadership and, in fact, youth leadership. My name is Israel Oyedare, and I'm the host of this podcast. I'm also the founder of Teens and Youth in Leadership, popularly known as TYIL, an organization focused on youth leadership development. Through this podcast, you will learn from seasoned professionals and leadership scholars on their thoughts and perspectives on youth leadership. Stay tuned. Today, I am excited to have a renowned leadership scholar and professor, a prolific author, and an expert in the field of leadership and followership studies, Barbara Kellerman. I'm so excited to have you today on this podcast.
Well, Israel, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. So you are a truly inspiring person, and you have garnered lots of accomplishments over the years. I would like to ask, what is one thing, or what has inspired you on this journey, on this career path of dedicating decades to studying leadership?
Well, I think it's a great question, because I think those of us that spend the better part of our professional lives focusing on a single area of inquiry, especially if we're in academia and we need to narrow our focus, there's usually some kind of autobiographical explanation. So I would say in my case, and I have said in my case, I think I grew up in a household that was quite political, in the sense that my parents were very interested in politics and often spoke about it. So I grew up with some, names of leaders were the first words that I ever spoke. So I think partly it was my family, my origins, where I came from, but partly it was also a personality thing. I seem to remember as a very little girl being interested in how some little girls, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old girls, dominate other 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old girls. I seem to remember always being interested in that dynamic. And then years later, and this is the last part of the puzzle, years later when I got to be a graduate student at Yale University, this was so long ago that there was actually no field called leadership studies. There was the word elite and the word management, but the word leadership was really not in fashion. This was in the 1970s, and I was astounded at that. I found it fascinating that what seemed to me to be so important, leadership, I didn't think about followers then, was essentially not part of the academic curriculum. So I would say my parents, my own personality as a child, and then when I got to graduate school, the realization that people were just not paying attention to something that I considered extremely important, that set me on the trajectory that I have found endlessly interesting my entire professional life. Never bored with the subject, and I'm officially retired from Harvard University, but I just came out with another book a few months ago, Leadership from Bad to Worse. And I write virtually every single day, and I blog regularly. Never do I find this subject boring, ever.
Wow, congratulations on your book. And I want to, on behalf of everybody who is studying leadership, I want to thank you for setting the pace and for just being in that area of leadership over the decades. The impact you have made over the years, they are very outstanding. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to ask one question about if your youth or your teenage years actually formed some of your ideologies about leadership, how maybe your teenage years could have influenced your ideology on leadership.
Yeah, I'm not sure they influenced my ideology. I'm not sure that's the word I would use. And I'm not even sure I have an ideology now, all these years later. That means you have a particular set of beliefs about something. And I'm not sure I have that about leadership. One of the things that interests me about it is that it changes all the time. You cannot believe one thing in terms of being ideologically fixed, because leadership and followership and the context is forever changing. So I think as a teenager, I don't think I had any idea what I wanted to do. I got married quite young. I had children quite young. And only later in my 20s did I really start to focus on that which interested me. But I do want to return to the theme of change and ideology. In 2014, I wrote an article for Daedalus, which is an MIT journal. And that article was titled Leadership, It's Not a Person, It's a System. So I never talk about leadership and fixate on the leader. I am forever talking in systemic terms. It's very simple, but it's slightly more complicated than just focusing on a single individual. So my leadership system has 3 parts, each of which is equally important. None is more important than the other 2. So part 1 is the leader. Even though I don't think leaders are all important, obviously I think they're important. Part 2 of equal importance are the followers or the constituents or the stakeholders, whatever word you want to use, those others that leaders need to bring along, must bring along if they want to create change. And part 3, again, of equal importance to the other 2, are the contexts, plural, within which leaders and followers are situated. And those things change. So I'm not sure the word ideology fits this subject particularly well. Again, what ideology implies is something probably slightly different from what I think of as a leadership system that is forever in flux, even though many things stay the same, including the human condition, human beings. So far as we know, they are the same as they were 2,000 or even 4,000 years ago. But many things change, and I think it's really important for students of leadership to be aware of how leaders change, followers change, and contexts change.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So yesterday I was watching a particular video with my family that you did in about 13 years ago, and you're talking about the dark side of leadership. Some years ago, you wrote a book, The End of Leadership. I'm interested in knowing your thoughts about the future of leadership. Do you think there's such thing as the future of leadership?
I do. Well, first of all, I'll just comment on your pointing out my interest in the dark side. There are a few things that distinguish me from my colleagues, nearly all of my colleagues. One is what has turned out my lifelong professional interest in what I call in a book that I wrote 20 years ago, bad leadership. And as we just said, my most recent book is called Leadership from Bad to Worse. So this issue of bad and how we define it, and what is a bad leader, what is a bad follower, is there such a thing as a bad follower? That dark side of leadership, my interest in the dark side of leadership separates me from nearly all of my colleagues who are much more focused on developing good leaders, whereas I raise the question of what is a bad leader and why do we have so many bad leaders and managers, not just in politics, but equally in the workplace. You know, what is it about us that we put up with people who make our lives miserable? So I'm very, very interested in the dark side. With regard to the other part of your question, when I use the term the end of leadership, actually that book, I think, which came out in 2012, the book called The End of Leadership, I think that was actually quite prescient because as it has turned out, and I was talking primarily about leadership in Western democracies in that book, and I was talking about the changing relationship between followers and leaders, and how followers were becoming increasingly emboldened and feeling entitled, and they were complicating the lives of leaders. And I think that expression that I came up with in 2012, the end of leadership, turned out to be, as I said, prescient. The world is much, again, I'm talking about leaders in democracies, whether private sector, public sector, in education, in religion. Leaders in Western democracies, separate from leaders in autocracies, are having a very, very difficult time leading. Followers simply don't want to be told to do what to do in the same way. And so leaders have to be far more politically skilled than they used to be and depend instead of so much on command and control, which a generation ago they did. They now have to rely much more on influence and persuasion. So again, leadership and followership change, and that's testimony to my point about change.
Yeah.
This podcast is sponsored by Teens and Youth in Leadership, TYIL Africa, an organization that is committed to raising generations of young leaders across Africa. Our programs include leadership education, leadership fellowship, research training, webinars and conferences. Stay informed of our programs by following us on LinkedIn at TYIL and TYIL Community on Instagram.
Now, let's take it back to youth. First of all, do you have any definition for youth in leadership?
No, because youth in Afghanistan and youth in Canada and youth in China have entirely different experiences and cultures and countries, which is why I say you cannot extract the word leader or leadership from the system. So in order to understand leadership in youth in Canada, you need to understand the Canadian context. Leadership in youth in Afghanistan, you need to understand the Afghan context. Those extreme differences in contexts are all important here. That is why, again, I never talk about leadership in isolation. It has to be leadership in context. And by the way, the context is not only geographical, it is temporal. So anything I said to you about leadership in 2024, whether it's leadership in youth or leadership anything else, by the time we get to leadership in 2029, 5 years from now, or if we look back 5 years, not to speak of 50 years or 500 years, things change. Social media is an obvious example of something that didn't even fully exist 10 years ago, whereas now its impact on leadership and followership, this applies, by the way, both to democracies and autocracies, is profound. So again, I urge your listeners and even you to remember the importance of context, because without understanding it, that is the importance of it, those questions cannot be intelligently answered. My own view is that most people in leadership who think about it are like you. They don't think sufficiently in terms of the follower, and they don't think sufficiently in terms of the context. But to extract the word leader or leadership and the conception, to divorce those words from followers and from the contexts within which both leaders and followers are situated, makes absolutely no sense. In fact, even in the United States, if you're a young leader at Microsoft, you're having an extremely different experience from being a young leader at the Ford Motor Company, not to speak of being a young leader at some startup or whatever. So context, followers, along with leaders.
So now, for a curious youth who is very passionate about leadership and leadership development, what do you think their focus should be in the regard of leadership development?
Well, I wrote another book about I write books about many different things. I've written many books, as you probably know. So this one is called Professionalizing Leadership. And I think, for some reason, and I'll talk about Americans, pay a lot of attention about how to educate and train doctors and how to educate and train lawyers and teachers and engineers. And it takes years to get your medical license, years to get a license to practice law and teaching and engineering. But for some reason in the United States, we think that, if you take a leadership course or you go to an executive program for a weekend or even several months, you too can be a leader. I am very unhappy about that. I wish we would treat leadership as we do leading, the skill of leading, as we would the skill of being a good physician or a good lawyer or a good teacher or a good engineer, even a good plumber or an electrician. I wish we would do 3 things to learn how to lead. By the way, the military in the United States, the military is the exception to the general rule. In general, the military does a very good job of this, much more than any other, again, I'm speaking about the United States only, much more than any other American institution or organization. The military does it right, and they do it, especially at the academies, in 3 steps. Step 1 is learning about leadership, not how to lead. I call that leadership education. Having an intellectual, cognitive understanding of what it means to lead and what it means to follow and what it means in different contexts. That's leadership education, step 1. Step 2 is leadership training, meaning skill development, whether that's negotiation or communication, whatever the skills that are associated with a particular leadership task, that I would put under the rubric of leadership training. And step 3 is what I call leadership development, which is lifelong learning. You cannot learn medicine and graduate from medical school in 2024 and assume you never need to learn another thing. Medicine is changing all the time. Science is changing all the time. Continuing education courses for physicians are mandated now. The same should apply to leaders. So in my fantasy world, this very rarely happens. Again, the military comes closest in the United States. Step 1, leadership education. Step 2, leadership training. In this sequence, by the way, 1, leadership education, 2, leadership training, and 3, leadership development.
Oh, this is so much. Like, you need to be studied. Barbara Kellerman needs to be studied. Thank you so much
I
sharing.
do think the book that I mentioned, Professionalizing Leadership, all my writing is in plain English. This is not difficult. Really goes through that. And I think it's, why shouldn't we train and educate our leaders the way we do our doctors and lawyers? Why? I don't get it. So. Yeah.
Let me ask my final question. There is this school of thought that there is such thing as global leadership. Global leadership is when you have cultural humility, cultural sensitivity, you understand the different cultures of people and you treat them that way. And you try to create a synergy between different cultures and you achieve goals. So do you believe that such concept exists following your proposition that, leadership is divided into 3 different variables: leaders, followers, and context? So do you think global leadership exists?
Look, I think it's mainly aspirational. In other words, something we can and should aspire to. If I said to you, who are the global leaders now? If I asked you that question, I'm not so sure you would come up with an easy answer. Even leaders of great international repute, let's name one who died relatively recently, Nelson Mandela. He was a figure in the United States and in Europe and around the world of enormous admiration. But can we really say he led Americans or Europeans? To some degree, he persuaded Americans they should act on the cause of apartheid. So that's to some degree. Even if we could say it about him or can, he is an extremely rare figure. So I would say about global leadership on issues such as climate change, which affects all of us, we should be aspiring to it. But it's not easy to come by, and I am not the kind of person who has rose-colored glasses.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. I've really learned a lot from this session, and I'm sure that my listeners, when they're listening to this, would just keep writing. Thank you very much. So before we end this podcast, do you have a final word or thought in the regard to leadership generally, or how youth can be more engaged?
My final thought is that everybody who aspires to be a leader should do what doctors do in medical school, which is to learn about the equivalent of the human body. So one of the first things that a young medical student does is to take a course in anatomy. What is the human body? Learn before they can operate or treat a human body. They have to know everything there is to know about the human body. They have to learn first before they do. They have to understand theory and understand the nature of what we're talking about, again, the human body, before they can prescribe a pill or operate on a leg. I would say there's a perfect analog, not one that's very typically used, but there's a perfect analog to leadership. Before we can do it, we need to understand it. We need to spend some time learning about the nature of power, the nature of authority, the nature of influence, the impact of the leader-follower dynamic. These are things that have to be intellectually understood before we can be a leader as long as one person follows us. But in order to be a good leader, we need to spend some time understanding how it works in different countries and cultures, how it works at different moments in times, how technology affects it. This is learning. This is not doing. Before you do something, you need to learn about it. And I would say this applies to leadership as much as it does to any other profession or even vocation.
Thank you so much, Professor Kellerman, for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Israel, for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you, so I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you for listening to the Future of Leadership podcast today. If you are here to kindly share, subscribe, leave a review, and follow us across our social media platforms, including Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, all at TYIL. See you in the next episode.